Thank you.
I'm gonna go ahead and pass our love offering. Pass this.
Do any of you know what Saints' Day this is today? I'll bet you haven't thought about it a lot. Today is St. Agnes' Day. Now, St. Agnes was the virgin saint of virgin, and she and if you properly slept and followed certain procedures, you would have dreams of your future husband. And so young girls were very, very anxious to go to sleep on St. Agnes Eve to find out who they were going to marry. Anyway, it's traditionally the coldest day of the year. And so the eve of St. Agnes, which was last night, is usually traditionally the coldest time of the year. So I just checked that out, and I found out that Chicago, the all-time low in Chicago, or average all-time low in Chicago, is on January 20th, last night. So this would vary widely depending on what part of the world you're in, but in England it was the coldest night of the year. Now, also I forgot to mention something last week I wanted to throw in here as an addendum. You know, we talked about the importance of tea gardens in England, particularly in the 1600s, the most famous of which was a tea garden known as the Parthenon, where women would invite men to give them tea. I forgot to tell you about another innovation in the tea gardens, and that was they'd have a box, and on top of the box it would say, "To ensure prompt service." Get it? To ensure prompt service. Tips. So it's out of tea gardens that we get the concept of giving tips, and typically they don't use boxes anymore, but that's a very kind of a formal way of doing it. Anyway, I want to talk today about sugar and chocolate. Now this is a vast subject, and I won't be able to do diligence with it, but I do want to talk to you about the history of sugar and its importance and how it came to be such a valuable commodity. They called it white gold because it was so almost priceless at one point. Refined, what we would call refined sugar, which is very readily available today, was not very readily available in the old days. It came, of course, from sugar cane. Now, sugar cane was indigenous somewhere in the Polynesian islands. And it started to make its way west. Polynesia was apparently the start of it, but then from there it moved west. One of the places that took a big foothold was in India. In fact, the word sugar is word as is candy. Both those words come from Hindi, and it gradually made its way farther and farther west. And of course, in the Middle Ages, the Crusaders came across sugar, and they were, like so many people, enamored with it. People were first enamored with it as medicine. It's odd for us to think of sugar as a medicine. Yeah, think of it almost as a toxic substance today, right? Particularly refined sugar, but they thought of it as medicine. In fact, in the Quran, it mentions that tea, that if you have tea and sugar, tea and honey, that this is very beneficial to you. Now, we should, in passing, say what the background was for sugar coming into the Western world. Up until sugar made its appearance, honey, of course, was the thing. And honey was, has always been a wonderful substance with much value, but it's also very difficult to deal with, right? Its viscosity is very thick. And so honey has a kind of interesting history. The Christian, early on in European Christian history, they got the idea that all queens were virgins. Now, this is a little hard for us to understand, but there was no king, let's put it that way. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, so they came to the idea of virgin. Therefore, they would make their candles out of beeswax, and only on and religious candles that were used in church had to be made out of beeswax. Of course, this created a huge industry for honey and beeswax. And so much so that there's a church day that is well known. It's called Candlemas, which means the Mass of the Candle. This was the day on which the beeswax candles were dedicated. People would bring their candles in, and the candles that were going to be used in the church had to be anointed. And this was done on Candlemas. Candlemas is 40 days after Christmas. Now, what happened on 40 days after Christmas? Carolyn, can you catch the door? 40 days after Christmas, Mary brought Jesus to the temple to be anointed in the temple, and she made an offering. Now, why is this so important? This is so important because this marks the day in the church year when Jesus officially becomes what's the word we would say? You would say in Christianity, baptized. There's another word I'm looking for in Judaism. But anyway, this was the moment that he enters into the community. Now, and so if Mary had a girl, it would be 80 days. She would be Mary would be ritually unclean for 40 days until the 40th day. Then she could brought Jesus to the temple. Then she could go home and be with her husband again. But if it's a girl, it's 80 days. Now, this gives you an idea of the relative views of men and women in that era. So this was the day they celebrated Jesus coming to the temple, but they called it Candlemas, the Mass of the Candles. Now, it's awfully important to understand that it took a long time for them to learn how to refine sugar from sugar cane. Basically, what they would do is boil the sugar, and they'd come up with this gooey mess that wasn't very helpful. Out of that, the byproduct, of course, of all this is called molasses. Now, molasses was huge as a low-cost sweetener. It was, I'm sure, somewhere in your life you've had molasses something, right? At least molasses cookies. But molasses is hard to work with, like honey. But it was cheap because it wasn't considered that valuable. But the one commodity they made from molasses was, anybody want to take a shot at this? It's called rum. And rum was hugely important. So important that the British Navy, it was part of the daily ration, a half pint of rum. Now, a half pint isn't a whole lot, but then it depends on how strong the rum is, right? And so rum was important. And it was eventually called grog, G-R-O-G, grog. And this is named after a general, I should say an admiral, Grogham, who allowed the settlers to have their grog. But it's really rum. And rum is still a huge industry, I should say. Now, I want to tell a story here about sugar cane, sugar refining. That's quite amazing, actually. There was a man in Louisiana, got a plantation, and I want to write down his name because, see if I can find a pen here. I'm not sure that you ever heard of this man. His name was Norbert. He's Relu. You can't really quite do the French U. But Relu, Norbert, of course, be Norbert, Relu in French. So that's the way he was known. Now, what's important about understanding this man's connection with sugar is, first of all, he is a Creole. Again, a very confusing and misunderstood word. The word Creole originally applied only to Europeans, such as French and Spanish, who were born in the New World. Let me repeat that. If your parents were French, but you were born in Louisiana, you were considered Creole. That is to say, second-class citizen. If your parents were wealthy enough, you would take the boat back to France, have the child, and then bring the child back to the Frenchman. So in Louisiana society, Frenchmen were the highest caste, and then the second caste were Creole. Now, Creole also comes to refer to the food that uses Native American fruits and vegetables and so forth, such as corn. No Frenchman in his right mind would eat corn on the table. I mean, you know that, right? Corn is exclusively for the use of pigs. And so if you ate corn, they would literally call you a pig. And the Germans are this way too. Good luck going to, say, Germany. Go to those European countries, they have a very bad attitude toward corn. And but all of these things that came from the New World, corn, tomatoes, green beans, squash, pumpkin. I mean, think about Thanksgiving meal. The point of the Thanksgiving meal is all that everything is indigenous to America, right? So you have the turkey, indigenous. You have the potatoes. You have squash. You have sweet potatoes. You have beans, for example. Even the chocolate and even the vanilla that might be used in the whipped cream. All of these things are indigenous to the New World, right? Well, anyway, back to, so these are called Creole foods. And the Europeans, when they came, took them a long time to accept these foods. We think, of course, nothing about it, but that's because we're all, in a sense, Creole. We're all born in the New World. Now, however, here's what happened to the word. The word transitions itself to instead of meaning people that were born in the New World, comes to mean people who are the product of marriages between classes, right? In other words, if a Frenchman marries a Creole, then the child is automatically Creole. But if a rich person marries somebody outside their social class, particularly if that person is black or Hispanic, that's moving out of your social class. So these then become Creole. So Creole in Louisiana today has to do with what we'd say are mulatto people of mixed race, right? And so the Creole people very strong up in northern Louisiana and Natchitoches. In Natchitoches, they have the first church, the first Creole church in America is built by these people. Now, if you know Louisiana culture well, you realize you have the elite plantation owners and also rich people. Then you have in the second class. These people, many of them are rich and own property and so on, but this is the Creole class, and they're very much historically second-class citizens, and eventually, before the Civil War, they were called free people of color. So they had some freedom, but not unlimited freedom. Anyway, this man here, Norbert, was a Creole. His father was Frenchman. His mother was a free person of color in Louisiana. Now, he might be the most famous Creole that ever lived. And I make this case in this way. He invented, he had his own plantation, he invented and patented the multi-effect evaporator. Now what this is an automatic sugar refining system. Before making sugar, they could do it, but it just required step after step and a lot of manual labor, and the slaves were very much involved in moving these containers, and they would be boiling hot and they would get burned, and I mean it was just awful. And Norbert, back in the 1840s, again this before the Civil War, he made this invention. Of course, he made a fortune from this invention, and it became adopted by sugar makers, cane sugar refiners all over the world. And so all of a sudden now, white sugar, which is expensive and hard to get, becomes mass-produced and becomes cheap because of this Creole man. Now, here's another oddity of history in Louisiana. Probably the most well-known Sephardic Jew in American history. There haven't been many Sephardic Jews in American history, so this isn't real tough. But anyway, maybe the one that reached in some ways very high stature was a man named Judah P. Benjamin. Okay? So Judah B. Benjamin is a real important person in our story. I think there's an H here on the Judah P. Benjamin. Now the Sephardic Jews, just so you'll know what we're talking about here, the Sephardic Jews were Jews from the south, from the Mediterranean world. The word Sephardic means Spanish Jew. And they spoke a language called Ladino. And they came. There have always been some Sephardic Jews in American history, but very, very few. The vast majority, probably 80 or 90% of all Jews that came to America are Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim are what we say is German Jews. They spoke a combination of German and Hebrew called Yiddish. And in Dallas here, for example, the Ashkenazim community was huge. And the Niemans and the Marcuses and the Sangers and the Harris and so on. All these well-known Jewish families in Dallas, these are all Ashkenazim. And this is true in New York, Macy's and so forth. Hollywood is made up entirely of Ashkenazim. They built their own empire out there. We call it the movie industry. And it is very, very important to understand that there are very few Sephardic Jews. But anyway, Judah P. Benjamin was a Sephardic Jew, and he was a lawyer. He trained at Yale. Remember me telling you how Yale came into existence. And he moved to New Orleans because it was a good opportunity for them to be a lawyer there. And he became very, very successful in Louisiana. He was a United States Senator from Louisiana. I believe this is the first Sephardic Jew, maybe the first Jew of any kind in the United States Senate. Anyway, Norbert Relu and Judah P. Benjamin were very close personal friends, spent a lot of time together. And they both had, this is odd in a way, because what does Judah P. Benjamin go on to be? He goes on to be, when the Civil War starts, in 1861, he goes on to be the Attorney General for the Confederacy, and eventually is elevated to the position of Secretary of State. One of the very highest positions in the Confederacy is held by Sephardic Jew. Now, yet here's his best friend, is this Creole man back in Louisiana. And so this, again, is part of the irony and paradox that comes in understanding how racial relationships were in the South and in Louisiana in particular, right? And but the idea is one of the reasons that they may have gotten along so well is they never quite accepted Judah P. Benjamin in their social circle because he was a Sephardic Jew. And they never quite accepted Norbert in their social circle because he was a Creole. And they knew it. I mean, everybody knew everybody's status. That's the most important thing. Now, moving on to the history of sugar, we need to mention beet sugar. Cane sugar was dominant until Napoleon needed a substitute for cane sugar. And they started experimenting, and a French scientist came up with the idea of growing beet sugars and refining them. And beet sugar then started to dominate, and eventually, well, under Napoleon, they had only beet sugar because the British blockaded France, essentially. And it wasn't until after the war that cane sugar started coming in. It was actually cheaper than beet sugar because it was produced in what way? Slave labor. And so they could undercut. So beet sugar went out of existence until the 1850s. The Mormons are out there in Utah, and they're far away. The cost of bringing products to Utah was enormous. They had to have these huge oxen caravans, and they carry sugar, and it was too expensive. So they decided to try beet sugar. They experimented and experimented, and eventually started to be successful with beet sugar. And it was in 1902 they set up a huge operation called UNI Sugar. Anybody ever heard of UNI Sugar? Years ago, UNI Sugar was huge. It's been long gone now, but UNI Sugar was Mormon operated because it was very valuable commodity to have refined sugar out west, so they didn't have to import it. It was extremely valuable. And eventually the whole West goes to beet sugar, particularly in Colorado and in other places in the West. Now, anyway, during the Second World War, the Nazis they were blockaded also, so Hitler had a big campaign for beet sugar. So they started growing massive amounts of beet sugar, and simply were able to get all the sugar they needed, plentiful supply indeed. Now, I want to talk to you now and transition over for a little bit into chocolate, but we're not really leaving sugar here because the main ingredient in chocolate, as you all know, is sugar, and so we'll talk about this kind of together. Chocolate, of course, is a New World product. They found it, Cortez found it when he went to visit the Aztec, found that Montezuma was drinking chocolate. And so he tried it, and he took it back to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also the King of Spain in Seville. Seville is the great center for the Spanish New World connections. And the Council of Indies, for example, was located in Seville, that controlled all of the Spanish colonies. Well, anyway, he introduced chocolate to the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's named Charles V. Now, this is the very same Charles V who interviewed Martin Luther and had the famous diet of worms. But Cortez offers him chocolate, and he likes it. So then, chocolate drink then becomes the drink of the royalty. Why? Well, it's very expensive, and so only the aristocrats and royals can have it. Now, the man, this is interesting. There's a man who I don't know if you've ever heard of. He's the father of taxonomy. Taxonomy is the discipline of naming things, organisms, and so forth. He's a Swedish man named Linus. Last name, Linus. Now, Linus is a really interesting guy because he came up with all these categories. It was Linus who came up, used the phrase Homo sapien, and he said that Homo sapien was a primate. Now, this is amazing because this is in the 1700s, right? This is 100 years before Darwin. And he says humans are primates. Well, anyway, his connection with chocolate, he gave the official generic name, if you will, scientific name for chocolate is Theobroma. Theobroma. Anybody want to take a shot at that in Latin? Theo means God. Broma means food. God's food, or food of the gods. Right? This Swedish guy, up there working, more or less by himself, up in Scandinavia, names chocolate the food of the gods. And when he did this, he knew nothing of chocolate bars. He only knew the drink. But they loved the chocolate drink, and it was a very, very big deal. Now, anyway, chocolates had a very fascinating history. One thing that I'm particularly got into was this idea that chocolate became popular right away, and in the Catholic Church, it became a big dispute whether or not chocolate could be drunk during the fast. Now, there were many, many fast days, particularly in medieval times. There were many, many fast days. And of course, every Friday, you were to not need anything meat-wise, but you could eat fish. And so, fish on Friday and all this. And also sometimes these fast days were days in preparation. So, for example, Lent, 40 days. Some people would fast the whole time. Now that's a fast, right? More than a month and a half. Now a real fast you would think would be water. That's it. But for over 10 centuries, the church had allowed wine during the fast. Okay. So this you can kind of see that in a way. Whether or not wine has great nutritional value or not, I think is now that issue's been settled. But back then, they didn't see any nutritional value in wine. The same with chocolate. So there was a huge controversy of whether or not chocolate could be drunk in the fast. And it was the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits had been formed in 1534. Ignatius Loyola, and the Jesuits were very much out on mission, in mission fields. And one of the things that the Jesuits were particularly good at is gathering up chocolate beans and selling them. Mark, this is one of the ways that they survived, particularly in South America. The Jesuits, of course, have their own unique history, and Jesuits got very, very crossways with the church authorities. So in 1773, the Jesuits were abolished by Clement XIV. And here's, again, one of the great ironies of history. The Jesuits would have been completely wiped out, except they had schools in Protestant countries. They were in Switzerland, they were in Germany, they were in Holland, they were in Poland, which at that time was Protestant, later became Catholic again. And so they argued that chocolate, now we're talking chocolate drink here. The chocolate bar had been invented. And they argued that it did not break the fast because it had no nutritional value at all. Now, on the other hand, the Dominicans, who were also great missionaries, they argued that it did break the fast. So Pope Gregory XIII finally settled this, and then 6 popes after that said that chocolate did not break the fast. So there was a big chunk of history in there where chocolate was allowed during the fast. But eventually it got thrown out as one of those things. Now, chocolate is important because it comes to be one of the 3 key drinks in England. Briefly they had chocolate houses, but most typically they would have coffee houses that also served chocolate. These were served because before 1700, tea was too expensive. Can you imagine? Tea was more expensive than chocolate or coffee. But after 1700, tea becomes very inexpensive, and that's because of the what? The East English East India.
British East India Tea Company.
East, there it is. It's East, I was leaving out. British East India Company. In other words, they just controlled the eastern half in the beginning. Eventually they controlled the whole country. But that's when they had that huge, we'll call it a shrub, 14 feet high, 14 feet thick. No, let's see. 14 feet high, 12 feet thick, and it ran 1,200 miles.
Oh, yeah.
To keep people that could only pass through certain places, and there they would have to pay the tax on salt. Remember that? Well, then ultimately the British try to control, and do control, tea and pepper and salt, those 3. And interestingly enough, they're in the tropics. They could have grown chocolate, but they didn't. You know, chocolate came from the New World, and there's still some chocolate growing here, but 70-80% of all the chocolate in the world comes ultimately from cacao trees, cacao seeds, plants, cacao beans that are from Africa. So it's been transplanted to Africa, and that's where it's been most successful. Now, so in these coffee houses and tea houses, they would